Well, I would like to begin my lecture with a dream, one that didn't come true, but as it happens so often in life, was leading to a new, perhaps even better one. Last autumn, I was asked to create an imperial dinner table for the permanent exhibition at the majestic monastery of Klosterneuburg, which you can see here, nestled on the shores of the Danube. And this exhibition is to commemorate the 300th birthday of Maria Theresa this year. Within the monastery's enfilade of Kaiserzemmel, which you can find on this level, there is a dining room, the first of its kind for the imperial family of the Habsburg at the time. In the early decades of the 18th century, tables were still set in different rooms dedicated to multiple purposes, depending on the nature and occasion of the meal or its participants. The Kaiserzimmer, the imperial rooms at Klosterneuburg, just outside Vienna, were designed by Donato Felice Daglio for Emperor Charles VI in 1739. Charles VI and his wife, Elisabeth Christine von Braunschweig-Wolfenbüttel, were only able to use the imperial rooms once, as the emperor died a year later in 1740, and with him the project of building an Austrian Escorial, which he intended initially, was left behind, and only the Sala Terrena, for example, reminds us of this project. It's still unfinished. And if you look at the building, you can see that this was supposed to be the central part, and more of these several courtyards here should have been built on this side. So that's why it was called the Austrian Escorial. Klosterneuburg had a special meaning to the Habsburg family. It was founded around 1100 by Margrave and later Saint Leopold, who became the patron of Austria in the 17th century. The Saint's Day is celebrated on November 15, and therefore Klosterneuburg was the destination for the annual court pilgrimage throughout the Baroque period. Maria Theresa had accompanied her parents a few times on this pilgrimage and intended to continue this important tradition after her father's death. And I have to say that it's still celebrated today without court pilgrimage, but school children have the day off, and there are great festivities each year on that day in the monastery. The court usually arrived on the day before the feast, on the 14th of November, and after the first immediate religious duties, the evening began with a small fasting dinner en retirade, consisting of fish, bread rolls, plums, and cheese. On the Saint's Day itself, private prayers in front of the relics of Saint Leopold and a festive grand mass were followed by a lunch en public, which was attended mainly by the abbot and his Chorherren, the monks, and the imperial entourage. Usually, when the imperial court was traveling, every detail needed to maintain an adequate standard and ceremonial had to be taken on the journey from Vienna, such as meat, preserved fruit, silver services, and the golden Mundzeug, the personal cutlery and spice box of Maria Theresa, which you saw on my first initial image, which in this case of the court pilgrimage to Klosterneuburg, which is just about 2 hours away from the Hofburg in those days. Nowadays it's a 20-minute drive. The imperial monastery was obliged to take care of the imperial family and their company. Long and exact shopping lists, Provisionslisten, lists of provisions, meticulously divided into the fasting and the meat meals for the Leopoldifest, were sent to the monastery by the Hofkontrollamt in advance to make sure that the imperial family got the right food. Well, my first dream of creating an authentic mid-18th century table I think we're all dreaming of that all the time, for Maria Theresa soon had to be revised, as all the precious loans I had in mind were not possible due to the lack of security in this wing of the monastery. To hide the arrangement under a plexi hood, which was the idea of the monastery, would destroy the splendor of this dining room. But one should always turn such a situation into a new chance, I think. A fresh, stylized, contemporary interpretation as a centerpiece seemed the way to go to avoid compromises, but I clearly needed artistic help. In a conversation with the designer and porcelain collector and friend Sebastian Menschhorn, who's somewhere there, we spoke about the Zuckerbäcker bills, the patisserie bills, which are still to be found in the Klosterneuburg archives in connection with the Leopoldi Fest on November 15th. Here you can see the Zuckerbäcker Konto and then some lists with which lists lemons and all kinds of ingredients which you need for lovely cakes and other Zuckerwerk, as we say in German. And then on the right side below, you can see part of the door which leads to the old ice chamber, which dates from the Baroque period, and it's still there. You can't enter it. It's a very strong door closing it, but you can find it, the old ice house. And as we know, Maria Theresa loved ice cream and all things cool, because she was a big lady and she felt hot very often. We find reports about that in diaries and other documents. Well, Sebastian immediately took out his crayons and made first sketches right away. We know that Maria Theresa was not extremely fond of sugar and sugary decorations, but she knew of the representative value of the dessert and also often remembered the sweet tooth of her friends, family and subjects by sending them chocolate, for example. For the Leopoldi Fest, all sorts of confections, such as 12 pounds of candied fruit from Genoa and dragées, the confetti of fruit, as well as 40 pounds of extra fine Zucker, inspired us to create a bright sugar centerpiece which should bring back the Archduchess's liveliness to the uninhabited Kaisersemmel today. Here's another design by Sebastian Menschhorn, and on the right, an illustration from the famous cookbook by Konrad Hager, the Salzburg cookbook, in which there are also sugar, like sugar canes, used to create these arches, and this was one of the inspirations we had. We chose red and white for this creation, not because we were thinking of Christmas, of course, but we had all these elements, according to Sebastian's design, made by a small sugar manufactory in Vienna, who you can watch make these long sticks of sugar, and we brought a piece so you can see the original color. So we had little arches made and circles, and all you can see, and underneath are structures made of turned gesso. They're very solid, and everything consists of different parts, which you can just put one on top of the other without gluing them together, so they can travel again if needed. And red and white is also the color of Vienna, the arms of Vienna, and later, of course, of Austria. And also it seemed to us that the red, the lively red, would correspond very well with the suite of fine tapestries by Lehner from Brussels with hunting and picnic scenes, which were hung in the dining room in 1739, so for the one and only dinner Charles VI had in this room. And they're still there today. Well, on the right side, you can see Maria Theresa in front of some of her gold service, and there is fruit here. And the occasion, it's just a small detail of a grand painting for the occasion of the marriage of Joseph II, her son, with Isabella von Parma. And it's nice to see her with her red cheeks, which I mentioned before, and her love for fruit, often cooled fruit or sorbets. And we try to recreate this love for fruit, which was quite common at the time, but it was also the main ingredient originally for desserts in general, because, as you might know, the dessert course was called Fruit, fruit. And we learned from Matthias Kramer and his German-Italian dictionary of the imperial and princely court language, published in 1700, that die Frucht aufsetzen means, well, to set up the fruit, to set up the dessert centerpiece. The lists of provisions for the court pilgrimage mention large amounts of fresh fruit, such as 140 lemons, 40 Portuguese bitter oranges, 400 apples, 250 Persian pears, 200 plums, 40 grapes. To represent this preference for fruit, we used colorless glass bulbs to emphasize the intention of creating a 21st century fantasy of a Maria Theresan dessert with an elusive and dreamy mood contrasting with the strong presence of the bright red. Sebastian added a sphere, which you will see on the next picture. No, sorry. I'll talk about the sphere later, sorry. And this boldness of the red and white seemed to be very suitable for the characteristics of Maria Theresa. She did not approve of complicated whimsy. A passage in the imperial Obersthofmeister diary, Prince Johann Joseph von Kiewenhüller-Metsch of 1760, describes how Maria Theresa was riding on horseback from the Hofburg in the city of Vienna to Klosterneuburg. Then she stopped her horse at the church door of the monastery. Prince Kiewenhüller took her hand as she jumped off the horse and led her to the altar to pray, still in her riding gear. If one imagines this scene and the personality behind it, bright red and a certain verve was needed for her birthday table. That's what we felt. So that's the layout, and you can see these blue circles. These are the original plates we added, and the problem was that in terms of silver or porcelain services, only very few objects survive from the monastery's old inventory. Amongst them, some plates in a typical Meissen style with German flowers and Neubrandenstein relief, Zierat, presumably introduced at the Vienna factory by a number of Meissen modelers and painters around 1750. Recently, the monastery was able to buy back a tureen from a larger Dupaquier service of circa 1730 with elegant chinoise decoration in iron red and purple and gold. The 1862 inventory of the monastery still mentions 4 large and 2 smaller tureens as parts of a former service, I quote, from old porcelain without marks. We all know what that is. These pieces had been on display in the famous 1904 porcelain exhibition at the MAC in Vienna, but afterwards their traces were lost. Well, all that remained was a Chinese ensemble of larger dishes and small plates in the monastery's storage. From the first half of the 18th century, they seemed to be the choice which Maria Theresa would have made for her dessert table. It was given to the popular abbot of the monastery and the court priest Wilhelm Sedlacek in the first half of the 19th century, and it is not surprising to still find more parts of this service in the holdings of the court silver chambers at the Vienna Hofburg. Even though no written proof has survived, it is very likely that the abbot received his share of this service as a gift in gratitude for his intimate position as a confessor to the imperial family. Imari seemed a little outdated in the Biedermeier period when the abbot received it, but was all the longing of the young Maria Theresa 100 years earlier. In her famous letter of 1757, of which I show a page here, to her close friend, ambassador and advisor, Prince Wenzel von Liechtenstein, she thanks him for his present of a wonderful piece of lacquer furniture, which she placed next to her canapé at Schloss Schönbrunn, and reassures him that nothing in the world, not even diamonds, pleases her more than things from India. And with India, of course, she means the Eastern Asian countries, China and Japan. And we decided, therefore, to set the table with the remaining Chinese dessert plates and dishes, and the ones, as you saw on the design, the ones we didn't have with the numbers, the little plates, dessert plates, were replaced by gesso imitations. So that's the kind of plates we found. And there you can see it on the table in the wonderful dining room. And here's the sphere I was talking about, which Sebastian added as a playful feature, which should also be maybe slightly irritating, and it works, I heard from some visitors, just to show that this is all a vision, a fantasy. From the diaries of Fürst Johann Joseph Kiewenhüller-Metsch, it is known that, for example, in 1743, after the evensong, Maria Theresa took her fasting supper en retirade, which means that she was more or less on her own with a few close friends, and she was served by her ladies-in-waiting, while Francis Stephen, her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who you see here, who was still only Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1743, and thus excluded from the imperial ceremonial, dined and played cards and games with his brother Karl Alexander and some ladies and chevaliers in the monastery. Only when Francis Stephen was elected and crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1746, he was allowed to sit next to his wife under the baldachin at the official meals. On some occasions, for example, as at receptions of ambassadors, he could not participate as just Grand Duke. Once crowned, he presided meals like the one for the Knights of the Golden Fleece, and that's a detail of a depiction of that occasion. And on the left, you find a bill for fresh fish from Upper Austrian rivers and lakes, which still survived. This is one of these shopping lists which the court sent to the Klosterneuburg monastery, demanding all sorts of rare fish from the rivers for the fasting dinner of Maria Theresa. In 1743, on the feast of Saint Leopold, lunch took place en public in the Kaisersemmel, with Maria Theresa seated under the baldachin, as the ceremonial required for meals in public. The list of provisions for the feast resemble one another, with vast quantities of, for example, 400 crayfish, 600 oysters, 600 mussels, these often used for fasting meals, but not exclusively, 40 pheasants, 20 rabbits, 34 partridges, 90 woodcocks, besides the usual beef, pork, chicken, 200 salads, cinnamon, white pepper, Tyrolean quinces, truffles, and 130 pounds of butter, and much more. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu already mentions in 1716 that the Viennese enjoyed oysters from Venice, which is very interesting, and chocolate from Milan. In 1732, Johann Küchelbecker reports from his travel to Vienna that the quantity and variety of food available on the markets of the imperial city was breathtaking, and that the inhabitants had delicate mouths. In 1743, lunch was served at the ground floor of Klosterneuburg for the ladies and gentlemen of the court, including Khevenhüller, who writes in his diary that they had put on their riding boots and clothes before eating, so that they could get on their horses immediately after the last prayers. No time was wasted at the Habsburg court. During the official lunch that year, there was an obvious chaos which disgusted the old Obersthofmeister Anton Count Ulfeld. Everyone took a seat where he or she pleased, which was unthinkable in the day of Charles VI or his predecessors, not even the ones. The official deplored the neglect of the ceremonial in those times of troubles, as they said. In that moment, in 1743, Maria Theresa was queen, or rather king, of Hungary and Bohemia, and Khevenhüller excuses her situation. I quote, "Since the court was young and the old etiquette was not convenient in many ways for the young couple, the difference between the imperial ceremony and the now royal one was quite noticeable." In 1741, at Wittelsbach, Karl Albrecht had been elected as Kaiser Karl VII. For 4 years until his death, the status of the Habsburg family had changed considerably with a simplified royal ceremonial and not an imperial one, as they were not emperors. It is often mentioned that Maria Theresa took advantage of the confusion and escaped the strictness of the Spanish ceremonial as much as possible. She probably did, but in fact, the political moment and her uncertain status made way for the dawning of a new era with some useful reforms. At the same time, the growing number of children at the Viennese court, not to forget her children, required a restructuring of the household. They were, one after the other, as they grew older, admitted to the meals en public. And here you can see some of them lined up. Each ruling member of the imperial family had their own chamber, their own little household, and Maria Theresa installed new chambers within the household for her children, each chamber for 2 children together, and each with their own tableware and table officials. As time passed, Maria Theresa found the court pilgrimages increasingly difficult to concentrate on, and she avoided to stay overnight in the cold monastery. For a few years, she would still have lunch en public in the dining room of the Kaisersemmel, which was situated after the first antechamera and the innere tirade, which led to the bedroom. The sequence of rooms gave the dining room a central and connecting position between public and privacy. The practice of watching the imperial family at table, as for example on this painting which depicts the engagement of Marie Christine with Albrecht. You can see, I find it quite interesting to look at the public, how this one, for example, looks with his glass, and they're really looked upon. The idea behind it was initially that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was physically very important and, so to speak, a public property. And to feed his body, to watch his body being fed, was almost a religious ceremony. That's why people watched him. But then, of course, there were people like this one. Or if you look at these faces, it's quite amusing, I think. They really pay attention to every detail, how people are holding their cutlery probably, or what they're wearing. I think it became in the 18th century, throughout the 18th century, more of a social event. So it's not surprising that the imperial family also needed some retreat. We have to speak of the court music very briefly. Georg Reuter was the composer, the favorite composer for the table music the servizio di tavola. And you can see here from also a detail from one of these wonderful paintings what chaos was there in the court musicians' loge. But it's said that only the very, very best musicians, court musicians, were allowed to play at the dinners. And I find it very interesting because if we have music while we have dinner, if we have it, it's just background music. And here it was very serious and very important. And as you know, probably Maria Theresa was a very good singer. She was educated professionally as an opera singer. And it's always nice to find these early Vienna figures from 1749 to 50 here, which were intended to decorate the dessert table. The practice of watching the imperial family at table on many of the official gala days, which were the birthdays, the saint days, was a possibility to grant privileges or to confirm existing positions of the nobility and high-ranking visitors. And music usually accompanied the lively dinners, and the Hofkapellmeister Johann Georg Reuter was highly esteemed. In Maria Theresa's view, as she was very serious about music, she was also very serious about education. And for her, education was the key of two nations' happiness. And she introduces a compulsory school attendance in the series of instruction tables for Archduke Ferdinand, one of her sons. The plant world of the Habsburg lands explains the use and the processing of plants, also for food, as sugar, wine, olives, nuts, and mushrooms. Feature here, that's the sugar. To raise consciousness for the elements of a meal, even within the family, which I find quite remarkable. With all the public experiences, even the most dedicated monarchs needed an escape. One of her favorite intimate places for meals and conversations, together with her husband or other friends, having chocolate maybe from a cup with a portrait of her husband, was the round East Asian cabinet at Schloss Schönbrunn. It was not only fitted out with her beloved lacquer, but also with a secret table, her table de conspiration, which would soon be called table de l'union, according to Prince Kevenhüller, to make it sound less suspicious to others. And you can see here, in the beautiful parquetry floor, this would be the table, and one can see a little line. And it was only discovered very recently when restorations were taken in this room that the table, the remains of this table are still to be seen, the little line, and you can also see it from the room below. But of course the mechanics are not working anymore. So here she dined in peace and quiet and played cards with Prince Kevenhüller, his wife, and other friends. He writes about these reunions in his diary. So, and as a note on the side, in this room, some du Paquet porcelain was discovered recently at Schönbrunn, where it used to be part of the oval cabinet's decoration, a wall vase in the shape of the one at the Gardner Museum, as well as bottles in the shape that is familiar to everyone who has seen the lacquer box with the tea bottles from Maria Theresa at Bonham's 2 years ago. They're much smaller than the ones in the casket, but it's the same shape, and it's very exciting, I think. More of escapes the lovely watercolor depicting the festivities along the road of Archduchess Maria Theresa to the Maria Antonia to the Liechtenstein Palace, where the French ambassador gave a splendid engagement party for her with peasants dancing, and that was something they loved to do, disguise as peasants. And this beautiful déjeuner in a private collection depicts just this love for being the innkeepers The imperial couple were the innkeepers of the inn of the Schwarze Adler, and the Schwarze Adler, the black eagle, was the secret name for the empress's apartments, her retreat. And these wonderful portraits, I'm sorry for the quality of the one on the left. It was taken very quickly in a present exhibition of Francis Stephen and Maria Theresa in Turkish disguise, show one of her other pleasures to disguise in oriental costumes for her balls, and she also had professionals to design these costumes. And here she is seen with her daughter, and the Dupaquier plate you probably all know. And sherbet bowls made at the Vienna factory. Sherbet was one of her favorites, the cold iced fruit. And Turkish disguise here at one of the court parties. Coffee, that's also depiction in Schönbrunn of a Turkish lady with coffee. She loved coffee, Maria Theresa. She had milk coffee every morning. And I recently discovered this little jug at the Museum of Applied Arts in Budapest with Maria Theresa as a widow. And my last slide is a close friend, a very close friend of Maria Theresa. And she is Countess Sophie Enzenberg. And recently, just very recently, 86 letters were discovered, very honest and extremely personal letters by Maria Theresa to the Countess Enzenberg in Tyrol, which reveal a certain depressive mood as a widow and an amazingly strong woman who might have lost her energies at last. Maria Theresa kept sending chocolate to her friend, and this déjeuner in a photograph at the MAC from the 1904 exhibition, where it was shown from the collection of one of Sophie Enzensberg's descendants, proves the friendship and what the diary says, they often had coffee together. Thank you very much.